In this lecture, we want to look at Chapter 3 of Essentials of Comparative Politics, Nations and Society. We want to look at ethnic identity, national identity, what citizenship and patriotism mean, the difference between ethnic identity and national identity and citizenship. We want to look at political attitudes and political ideology. And then we'll focus a bit on religion, fundamentalism, and identity crises. And then look at political culture before we sum up. The textbook defines society and then discusses two types of social identities. So society is a collection of people bound by shared institutions that define how human relations should be conducted. Social identities help us answer the question of who am I, and are one way in which people organize themselves in a broader society. So it's a sense of who a person is based on membership in social groups. So let's look at ethnic identity. While ethnicity is often based on genealogy, it's important that we don't overestimate this biological component. Ethnic politics researchers sometimes use the term imagined communities to describe ethnic groups. The origins of ethnic group identities may be more based on myth than actual reality, and with the frequency of group intermarriage, purity ideas are also generally missed, as genetic analysis shows little significant differences between ethnic, religious, or racial groups. In addition, the distinction between one group and others can be very minor, especially to outsiders. So ethnic identities, ethnicity, these are attributes or social institutions that make one group of people culturally distinct from others. Those institutions would include language, religion, their location geographically, customs, their physical appearance, and of course a shared history. People are born into these identities and remain fairly stable throughout their life in many places. We call this ascription. But border areas between groups can be much more blurry than we might think. So if we look at different examples or markers of ethnic identity, and we use these three examples, Bosnia, the Croats, the Serbs, the Bosniaks, their main marker of differentiation is religion, not really their ethnicity in terms of some discernible biological or religious or cultural differences. If we look at in Rwanda, the Hutu and Tutsi ethnic groups are really non-discernible. So if we look at the biological, religious, or cultural practices that differentiate the Hutus from the Tutsis in Rwanda, we really see that Rwanda's ethnicities are largely colonial construct, with the original classification based on a family's wealth, such as the number of cattle that the family would own. If we look at the United States, if we have to ask this question, our nationality, we are a melting pot and a salad bowl of mixed ethnic identities, but we are still Americans as a nation. So is race and ethnic identity in the United States important for us to analyze? Or do we see something different where, depending on who we are in terms of our mix racially, we may share the same religion but have very discernible features which are black or white, European descent, or indigenous descent. But still, part of our ethnic identity in the United States is that we are American, although we do have perceived differences of our ethnic background based on our forefathers. So why does ethnicity matter? The book points out that groups with high degree of ethnic solidarity may be more willing to redistribute resources within the group, and conversely, less willing to share resources with groups that are ethnically different. Ethnic traditions can also shape societal norms, which in turn influence people's behavior. If we return to the Rwanda example, even though the Hutu and Tutsi will look identical to outsiders and are even difficult for their own group members to tell apart, these ethnic differences still become the center of a genocide in the 1990s. The belief in a shared ethnic heritage is also very powerful. Research on civil wars by authors like Elaine Denny and Barbara Walter find that if a civil war begins, it is more likely to be initiated by an ethnic group than any other type of group. Similarly, civil wars fought between two different ethnicities tend to be longer and more difficult to resolve than other types of conflicts, reaffirming the power of this kind of difficult to observe but important identity. So in defining ethnic identity, we see a set of specific attributes and societal institutions that makes one group of people culturally different than others. It's often based on customs, language, religion, and other factors. As far as ascriptive, it's generally an identity that's assigned at birth. And it's not necessarily or inherently political in its definition. So now let's look at national identity. Moving from social to socio-political identities, a national identity is the sense of belonging to a nation and is the identity basis of what we call nationalism. Unlike ethnicity, which can be politically neutral, national identity is inherently political. It's an inherently political social identity. So desiring a state, after all, generally means that your group is engaging in activities to try to make this goal a reality. They can be peaceful, such as protesting or lobbying governments, or violent. Nationalism is a major motivator for several terrorist groups or civil war insurgents around the world. So a nation is a group that desires self-government through an independent state, if possible, and national identity are institutions that bind people together through common political aspirations. Nationalism, a pride in one's people and the belief that they have a unique sovereign political identity, is how we would define nationalism. The idea of nationalism is connected to the idea of a nation. We want to be governed as a group by ourselves, but who counts as part of ourselves? So if we look at examples of nations in the United States, is there an American nation? Native American tribes like the Cherokee Nation are definite nations within our state. But as a mix of different ethnic identities, do we in fact combine to become a nation? Nations in other countries like Canada and Quebec are too different. We have Francophone Canada in Quebec, and we have English-speaking Canadians, but they are still Canadians within their state. In China, we have the Xinjiang and the Tibetan nationalities. We have in the UK, we have Scottish nationalities seeking their own independence. We have, of course, Irish Republicans in Northern Ireland. If we focus on these concentrated national minorities in places like China, or in Canada with French Quebec, or in Scotland with the Scottish independence movement, we see that these groups really better fit this definition of nations within a political state. With 2 official national languages, Hindu and English, 14 constitutionally recognized languages, and another 30 languages spoken by more than 1 million speakers, India has a high rate of diversity. Some groups have pushed for regional autonomy and even independence, the most famous being the mostly Muslim population of India's Kashmir region. In this disputed region, both India and Pakistan claim authority over it. And it has a history of political violence inspired by the Kashmiri unique national identity. More recently, tensions have flared over the Hindu-dominated central government's decision to strip the special status of Jammu and Kashmir, which gave this state significant autonomy. But not all nations seek their own state, however. Some are happy with regional autonomy and cultural rights within an existing multicultural state. Other nations in India have chosen to seek self-determination through India's federal structure, which grants regionally concentrated minorities considerable local powers. So depending on the country around the world, we may see a push for more independence or less independence if a structure such as the federal relationship between center and region allows for considerable power in terms of local governance. So a national identity is a sense of belonging to a nation, a group that desires self-government. and a belief in political aspirations, often but not always derived from ethnic identity. It's inherently political, and the basis of nationalism, which is pride in one's people and the belief that they have a unique political destiny, are an important part of defining a nation. We are still in the realm of aspirations here, so for the moment we will leave aside any practical political realities. In some cases, we have the idea that one of the groups we belong to is the one that is appropriate for us to be governed by. The people within a group share the idea that it's okay for them to be subject to the common set of rules based on that identity. So if we are Americans or Canadians, to give another example, we think it is appropriate for us to be subject to similar rules. We would think it's strange or inappropriate if outsiders are making the rules. Who am I and who are we? That is, what is the group of people of which I am a member that ought to govern itself? The answer to that question is the definition of a nation. Now let's move on to citizenship and patriotism. If ethnicity is largely social identity and nation is a combination of social and political, then citizenship is purely political identity. In addition, ethnic and national identities may be considered deep social identities, seldom changed and even passed down through generations, while citizenship is a more shallow or flexible one. While it's nearly impossible to change your ethnicity, your citizenship can be changed, provided you follow the rules laid out by your new adopted society. Keep in mind that being a citizen does not necessarily make you patriotic, which is pride in one's state. On an interesting twist on the above point, new citizens can be intensely patriotic. A 2019 study by the Cato Institute found that in the United States, immigrant citizens were much more patriotic and more trusting of the U.S. government than native-born Americans. The big picture, the identity you choose can often be more important than the one you were born into. So what's the difference between nationalism and patriotism? You can look at your book 71 to 72 to look at a discussion of how these identities overlap and how they're also distinct. So what's the difference? Nationalism is pride in your people and a desire for statehood. A group may or may not have its own state. The group may not like the current state very much. Patriotism is the pride in your state, where the group in itself has a state, and individuals have a weaker attachment to their ethnic and national identities and recognize their citizenship within a state. When nations and statehood overlap, nationalism and patriotism can also overlap. However, when there is disconnect, nations that lack states or states comprised of multiple ethnic groups who are generally happy with their state, individuals may have one but not the other. The book mentions the example of Palestinians who seek statehood but have more critical views of the Israeli state. They possess nationalism but not patriotism. Americans, in contrast, have an international reputation of being intensely patriotic. But the actual nationalism is largely limited to fringe groups within society. So citizenship is that an individual's relation to the state. The citizens swear allegiance to the state, and the state in turn provides certain benefits or rights. In one sense, that old idea of social contract provided by Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan, and later John Locke, who helped define that social contract here in America through Thomas Jefferson and our founding fathers. Citizenship is purely political and thus more easily changed than ethnic identity and national identity. You can move to Canada and become a Canadian citizen. And the basis of patriotism is often the pride in one's state and one's citizenship. Sometimes one nation dominates two states, but may still be considered divided. For instance, there may be one Korean nation, even though there are two Korean states, North and South Korea. Multinational states are countries with more than one nation, more than one politically defined identity group. For example, the United Kingdom is a single state with more than one nation. People in Great Britain typically think of Scotland and Wales and England as being separate nations united under a common state. In the developing world, many state borders were drawn to reflect colonial power or administration rather than population realities. So as a result, many developing states contain multiple nations. Nigeria, for instance, has over 250 separate ethno-linguistic groups. So, if we look at the United States and Canada, we might plausibly fit the description of a nation and a state, although this could be up to debate, particularly when you look at the various different nations within the U.S. in terms of, and also Canada in terms of indigenous populations, but particularly in Canada when you see Quebec, a French national identity versus the English identity, but they all have pride in their Canadian citizenship. The Palestinian-Kurdish struggles for statehood are frequently in the news, and you may be able to come up with some examples of nations that do not have states of their own. For example, Tibetans and many American Indian nations do not have their own states as well. The final distinction between country and nation is important. Nation is not a legal distinction. Rather, it's a description of how people feel. So while some countries, such as Japan, claim to represent the will of one nation, few countries have such a clean matchup between nation and country, especially when considering modern migration patterns. Japan is very restrictive when it comes to immigration into their country. Even countries dominated by one group are not necessarily a perfect matchup either. Egypt is predominantly Arab, but it does possess a sizable about 8% Coptic Christian minority. Population-wise and politically, the Arabs dominate Egyptian politics, but the Copts, the Christian Copts, have played a significant influential role in Egypt's economy. Given these overlaps, it's important to keep in mind that none of these identities are exclusive. Everyone possesses some combination of ethnic, national, and citizenship identities, which in turn shape how we see the world, or at least our role within it. Let's now turn to ethnic identity, this national identity and citizenship, its origins and its persistence. So where do identities come from? Many identities emerged alongside the modern state: increased commerce, urbanization, new forms of social interactions, and new institutions. State leaders have often seen identity creation as a means of reinforcing their power. Ethnic and national identities, in turn, have transformed the state. Again, the nation-state, a sovereign state encompassing one dominant nation that it claims to embody and represent. The original nation-state, we can look to France, that emerged during the Napoleonic era. This nationalist sentiment motivated a huge volunteer army that would conquer much of Europe. But by the early 20th century, most multinational empires in Europe are actually replaced by nation-states. Other examples of nation-states where the national group and state are essentially the same might include Germany, Japan, Yemen in the Middle East. And you can probably think of others. We often think of France as that prototype nation-state. The country where it's a French nation that's defined by culture, language, food, and various customs, and the French state, which is a political organization, are combined together. But France, as a colonial power, has had immigration from mostly North Africa, and bringing in with it an Arab community and Islamic religion, as well as immigration with Arabic language. But even though we see this minority within France, we see that France will seek to ban the burqa and other headscarves in public spaces, mostly as a response to Islamic fundamentalist terrorism that has been on the rise, and also the fundamentalism of France's second-generation immigrants, those that were born and raised in France but feel disrespected from their own ethnic identity as French Arabs. if we look at ethnicity and national conflict, ethnic conflict is the conflict between ethnic groups that struggle to achieve certain political or economic goals at each other's expense. The national conflict is when groups who seek to gain or prevent the other from gaining sovereignty. So consider a situation in which ethnic and national identities are different and ethnic identities are more important to at least some people than are the state identities. You might look at different ethnic and national conflicts around the world, but one very famous one that would fit into both these categories would be the Troubles in Northern Ireland. While it first emerged as a civil rights movement seeking to address discrimination the Catholic community experienced in regards to voting, to jobs, and to housing, it quickly escalated into an insurgent conflict pitting the UK state, the Protestant loyalist militia, and the Catholic Republican militia against one another. It fits the definition of national conflict because the Republican group sought to have Northern Ireland rejoin the Republic of Ireland, while the Protestant groups sought to remain part of the United Kingdom. It's important to remember that conflicts that are often seen as irreconcilable, even those that have gone on for centuries, can be in fact de-escalated. While tension remains between the Protestant and Catholic communities in Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement has gone a long way toward building peace. However, these conflicts can re-escalate. Given how Good Friday was tied with the European Union membership in a number of ways, the UK's vote to leave the European Union, known as Brexit, leads some to worry that this conflict in Northern Ireland may re-emerge. But we also see some indication that it may in fact unify the Irish together, knowing that they see the Republic of Ireland in the south, the independent nation of Ireland, maintaining its trade ties with the European Union and seeing that benefit. So there may be pushback even from Protestants in Northern Ireland to that decision by the UK as a whole. When we study why ethnic and national conflicts occur, there are a number of explanations. There's a societal explanation where ethnic heterogeneity, where the degrees of integration or whether there's polarization have impact. There's economic explanations, where if there's a struggle for resources or there's economic inequalities within the state, you may have ethnic and national conflict. And of course, there are political explanations. The state and the regime, for example, the state's capacity, its relative autonomy. Is it a democracy or a non-democracy? They can have an impact. If we look at Africa, there's tremendous ethno-linguistic diversity, in Africa. And because of its colonial impact, lines were, in a sense, drawn that did not reflect the ethnic breakdown of the people living on that continent. They were divided by European powers into states without regard to national identity. If we look at Nigeria, we have an identity conflict. All right? Nigeria has extreme divisions, political exclusion and corruption. It has income inequality, and it has conflict over oil revenues. Nigeria has a long history of civil conflict, and the emergence of the terrorist militant group Boko Haram reflects this long-term pattern. Nigeria is a country with extreme ethno-linguistic diversity, and the major groups tend to view politics and economics as a zero-sum game among these different groups. If one group wins, to them, the others lose. So when you add in the widespread corruption, you add in ethnic favoritism from the regime in charge of the political state, the government, they have led to considerable resentment against the central government, and Nigeria's extreme regional disparities in wealth have been made worse by the discovery of oil within the delta. So can constitutional design reduce ethnic conflict? The case of Nepal is a good example. Nepal's path towards civil war is summarized in the Institutions and Action section in Chapter 3. But we want to focus here on how Nepal's new democratic constitution has been designed to prevent this conflict from reemerging. Transitioning from a monarchy, Nepal's new constitution created 7 new provinces with regional legislatures. So unlike in India, this federal system is symmetric, not asymmetric. And despite resistance from the Madhesis, the regions were not drawn based on ethnic lines. Numerous issues remain highly contentious, including what to name these regions. The last of Nepal's 7 regions, Koshi, finally received an official name in March of 2023, almost 8 years after the 2015 constitution was adopted. As of 2023, the new federal system has seen a reduction in violence and greater political participation in politics. While peace is a long-term project, Nepal has so far remained on a hopeful path in that direction. So this leads us to the question, can federalism solve ethnic conflict? If we want to predict whether Nepal's constitutional reforms will successfully reduce conflict, we might look to past cases that have tried a similar solution. The question and methods section of our book, pages 98 to 99, details this policy option's past performance. Some cases of federalism have led to the state dissolution, something most scholars and policymakers would consider a failure. However, many federal systems, such as in Canada, successfully held together the diverse populations between the French-speaking and the English-speaking Canadians. In general, while it's not perfect, devolution of power and federalism may be a good option of last resort to help solve ethnic conflict within states. So if we look at the views of ethnic and national conflict, societal explanations generally emphasize such issues as ethnic heterogeneity. Economic explanations emphasize poverty and the struggle for natural or other resources. And political explanations would emphasize state capacity or the autonomy of the state and the type of regime that it is, democratic or non-democratic. So let's look at political attitudes and political ideology. Political attitudes are basically concerned with the speed and methods of political change that generally they're classified as radical, liberal, conservative, or reactionary. Particularistic attitudes are relative to the specific context of a given country. So radical in one country, for example, may be conservative in another, and they're distinct from political ideologies. So starting with the big terms, attitudes are the way people think about the political process as a whole. Political attitudes are viewed as views regarding the necessary pace and scope of change and the balance between freedom and equality. So again, if we look at the different categories, radicals prefer large institutional change. Liberals prefer changes, but within institutions. Conservatives are skeptical of change, usually favoring the status quo. And reactionaries seek to restore political, social, and economic institutions, real or imaginary, that they see as being strong in a previous time. So on the left, we have the radicals and the liberals. When we think of people or movements with radical political views, we may include the Arab Spring in 2011. We may look at Russia's and Iran's recent protest waves. And of course, we have to look at ourselves in the American Revolution of 1776. Again, radicals favor dramatic, often revolutionary change to the existing political, social, and economic order. They believe old institutions are broken and they must be replaced. If we look at the liberals, they favor the gradual evolutionary change rather than revolutionary change. And they believe that existing institutions can create, in fact, positive change. And I think we can look at the U.S. Democrats and see that that kind of evolutionary change can happen. On the right, if we look at conservatives and reactionaries, the conservatives are skeptical of change. They value continuity of the institutions. The traditions that worked before should be respected now. There's a fear of change and a fear that the change will have unintended effects. In Germany, if we look at the Christian Democrats, they generally are on the right and are conservatives in that sense. The reactionaries' view is one that the current order is fundamentally unacceptable, and they try to return to the older system. We can think of Make America Great Again as a reactionary political position on the right. So for a conservative, historical example might be the British political theorist Edmund Burke. He valued liberty but was concerned about the rapid changes taking place in France during the Revolution of 1789. He saw people losing control and setting in motion changes to the basic structure of society that they would not be able to control. British conservatives, therefore, sought to prevent large-scale institutional changes to the British system of government and to society at large. For a more modern example, in Germany, the Christian Democrats favor supporting the traditional institutions of the family, religion, and community. And obviously, here in the United States, we're dealing with a Republican Party that has, in fact, engaged in more reactionary views of government. In 2016, the campaign slogan, Make America Great Again, reflects this desire to return to a nostalgic past. So, in this way, if we look at a continuum view, this way of thinking about it as a continuum, makes sense if the question is how open people are to change. If we look, liberals welcome change while radicals demand deep change. Conservatives reject future change while reactionaries reject even past changes. In the early 1900s, communists and socialists who sought left-wing social change, more powerful unions, restrictions on capitalism, for example, were most active in supporting change. As a result, the terms radical and liberal came to be associated with leftist politics. In many countries, however, this was not the case. In North Korea today, for example, a person advocating democracy and free markets would be called a radical. This is why they're particular to the country. Radicals and reactionaries also have other traits in common. Both support violence in some instances, and both see existing regimes as being fundamentally illegitimate. On the other hand, liberals and conservatives accept the legitimacy of the existing regime. So within this circle, radicals and reactionaries want dramatic change, but the liberals and conservatives support the existing institutions. So in focus, ideologies are about what kinds of policies people would ideally prefer their government to pursue. They're sets of political values regarding the fundamental goals of politics. They're exemplified by those 5 dominant modern ideologies: liberalism, communism, social democracy, fascism, and anarchism. They're universalistic, so they're not specific to one country or time, and they're distinct from those political attitudes we discussed. So keep in mind that other ideologies do exist and may even reflect a major part of the political party spectrum in some countries. For instance, green or environmentalism and Christian democracy are widely seen in Europe. But political ideologies, as a definition, are basic values held by an individual about the fundamental goals of politics and the ideal balance of freedom and equality. So for liberalism, their goals are individual freedom. For communism, it's economic equality. Social democracy or socialism, or what I might call social capitalism, is that balance between freedom and equality. And fascism, which is an advancement of a superior group or a race. And then anarchism is the complete elimination of state power. In liberalism, what is the role of the state? What are acceptable state actions? In other words, what makes liberalism different from anarchy? Liberalism looks that limits the state's role in politics, society, and economy. People, as individuals, pursue their own interests. As Thomas Jefferson said, the legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God, if neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. So The focus of the individual and their freedom in liberalism does matter. And it inspires liberal democracy, a system of political, social, and economic liberties supported by competition, participation, and contestation. So for the term liberalism as a political attitude, it favors slow evolutionary change, and as a political ideology outside North America, it favors free markets and individualism and accepting greater inequality. As a political ideology in North America, it favors a greater state role in limiting inequality. Many outside the region would call this idea social democracy. And as a political economic system, it favors a limited state role in the economy. So in the United States, liberal often refers to someone who supports what we would call left-wing policies. However, in Australia, for example, the Liberal Party is more of a center-right party. The confusion is that liberalism refers to both an attitude and an ideology. A liberal attitude supports gradual change within existing institutions. A liberal ideology places a high value on personal, political, and economic liberty. The idea here is that communists believe that political liberty without economic equality is an illusion. As long as there is economic inequality, people will always be subject to coercion and manipulation. The only way to have true freedom is to free people from the constraints of a market economy. So communism rejects the idea that personal freedom, as the liberals would argue, will ensure prosperity for the majority, that the state's role is really to ensure that wealth is shared and that there's no private property. From each according to his ability to each according to his needs, as Karl Marx has stated. And of course, we see communism in places like the Soviet Union, in China, and in Cuba. Social democrats seek a balance between individual freedom and economic equality. European states with market economies that also feature large welfare states and government services in support of economic equality come closest to achieving this ideal. So social democracy balances freedom and equality much more so than liberals or the communists. Balance of strong markets and the role of private ownership, the strong state to regulate industry and engage in social spending. So for Tony Blair in Britain, the former prime minister, socialism stands for cooperation, not confrontation, for fellowship, not fear. It stands for equality, not because it wants people to be the same, but because only through equality in our economic circumstances can our individuality develop properly. So if we look at Germany and the Scandinavian states, we see social democracy, where we balance the role of markets and a strong role for private ownership with the need for government to engage to manage inequality, what we would call social democracy, or an economic system that we can refer to as social capitalism. Fascism, however, rejects ideas of freedom and equality, believes in strict social hierarchic and inherent inequalities. So it can be explicitly racist or ethnocentric. As Hitler has stated, National Socialism is exclusively a Volchek, political doctrine based upon racial principles. So if we look at fascist regimes in history, obviously Nazi Germany is one of those examples. Re-emerging with far-right parties and neo-reaction philosophies that we would see today. The idea here is that any system based on individualism will be inherently weak. The nation is an organic whole, and individuals are best motivated by appeals to their common racial consciousness. Far-right nationalism has seen a resurgence in Europe in recent years as a reaction to the continent's economic troubles, as well as to the increasing immigration that we see in Europe, including an influx of refugees from the Syrian conflict and from North Africa. Far-right parties are doing better in the polls, and anti-immigrant protests and violence against immigrant communities have been increasing as well. Anarchism is a system that has never been implemented, although strains of it emerge in various protest movements. Libertarians in the United States are one example of such a group, as they see government itself as the primary threat to freedom and equality rather than an enabler of freedom and equality, as other ideologies such as liberalism would posit. Most comparative scholars, however, would point out that states play an important role in societal organizations. Considering that anarchy seems to be an ideology found in functioning states, but not failed states, it may reflect a classic example of a luxury political ideology. So, anarchism views the state as a threat to our freedom and equality and believes that eliminating the state and private property would achieve both freedom and equality. As John Lennon said, imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. Of course, it's nice in principle, hard to do in fact. In your book, you have a list of ideology and political attitudes. Take a look at that graphic. And then also, here's a final comparison of the major ideologies and their differing value balances. As you can see, high freedom, you see liberalism and anarchism. Low freedom, you see communism and fascism. High equality, you see anarchism and you see communism. And with lower equality, you would see liberalism and fascism. So let's take a look now at religion and fundamentalism and the crisis of identity. So many of the ideologies just covered, liberalism, communism, etc., fit with what Max Weber described as the disenchantment of the world. That is, the replacement of faith in the mystical and spiritual by faith in the material world, in human institutions, and in the notion of progress. The rise of political identities such as citizenship, nationalism, and ideology led to the privatization of religion, which entailed removing faith from the public sphere and relegating it to private life. However, in recent decades, we've seen this focus on secular politics come under attack even in developed Western countries. Some of it's because, in the face of a major crisis, such as the 2008 financial crisis, two of the most dominant secular ideologies, liberalism and social democracies, had difficulties coping with these major crises, leading people to revert to the perceived safety of old beliefs. So, for some countries, secularism was weakly institutionalized, so it never had a deep hold on the country's political culture. Not mentioned in the book, but something that might be interesting to discuss or to think about is whether the shift toward anti-scientific views, such as the flat earth believers, the anti-vaxxers, for example, may be a cause or a consequence of this anti-secularism shift. After all of these things relate to a rejection of the status quo and often have a very emotional response. Fundamentalism is the idea that a set of religious ideas can govern society, and as an alternative to political ideology. It explicitly rejects the idea, at least in principle, that humans can govern themselves. Instead, fundamentalists seek to implement a divinely ordained set of laws that do not, according to their views, derive from human thought. As our book discusses, fundamentalism is not religiosity, Puritanism, or religious conservatism, as these movements generally disengage and isolate themselves from the political sphere. It is also not pre-modern. It seeks not to return faith to a pre-modern role, but rather to restructure religion as the central political identity, to make faith the sole foundation for a modern regime. It's a result of reactions to modern issues and the social isolation often felt by people overwhelmed by the fast-changing world that they live in. Regarding political attitudes, fundamentalists may be radical, reactionary, or combine both. Often they speak of returning to the golden age of faith, but their prescriptions for change are reactions to modern problems, and the political systems they envision are utopian rather than grounded in actual historical reality. Because fundamentalist belief tends to be held by a minority in most countries, it is more frequently associated with extremist and fringe elements in society, such as the terrorist group ISIS in the Middle East. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution was an example of a rare successful fundamentalist movement, as it succeeded in establishing a political system in Iran that empowered the clerical establishment, a theocracy. The Taliban in Afghanistan would also be another example, but otherwise, fundamentalist movements seem more typical of radical non-state actors than of legitimate political players. Now let's take a look at political culture. As the textbook states, culture is a kind of social roadmap, providing norms and priorities that guide people as they organize their lives. In contrast, we can think of political culture as something that shapes how people behave in their public political lives. So culture is a content of the institutions that help define a society. So it's a roadmap to organize personal and social lives. Political culture are the basic norms of political activity in society, a roadmap to organize public and political life. In some countries, it is commonly accepted that the state plays no role in promoting a particular religion, while in others, the state is expected to play a role promoting religion, family values, and deference to authority. So political culture is the basic norms of political activity in society, a determining factor in what ideologies will dominate a country's political regime, and it's unique to a given country or a group. And this is distinct from political attitudes and ideologies that we've discussed. There are two views of political culture. We have on one side Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations, where he saw culture as religiously based, and that culture is permanent and unchanging. To Inglehart's World Values Survey, which looks at an individual level and sees major divisions, the traditional versus the secular rational, survival versus self-expression. Cultural values varies across and within societies, and culture, in fact, or values do indeed change. The class of civilization, which has been very common in pop political culture politically, has largely been discounted by political scientists. It really has not withstood empirical scrutiny, and it dramatically oversimplifies a world of complexity, overpredicts conflict between civilizations at the expense of conflicts within civilizations, focuses on states rather than separatist or terrorist groups, and it's significantly worse than rival theories at predicting international conflict. The different approach to culture that we find by Inglehart in his World Values Survey was based on a series of surveys carried out across multiple countries and time periods, where he classifies political values into certain universalistic principles. These are that traditional versus secular, rational, which is pretty self-explanatory. Survival values emphasize economic and physical security and are associated with low levels of trust, while self-expression values are focused on high levels of tolerance and demands for individual participation in politics. One thing about Inglehart is by focusing at the individual level, he is able to show how much variation exists within broad cultures and within individual countries, not just between them, as clashing as Samuel Huntington has suggested. Another key finding is that political values do in fact shift over time, sometimes very suddenly, and this survival self-expression is especially tied to economics, which is a major argument by Inglehart of this post-material values. In other words, culture may be sticky, but it's also dynamic and can change. Ultimately, what Inglehart shows us is that there is much more cultural variety within Huntington's classic civilizations than Huntington's analysis would allow us to consider. Economic development shifts some values, but other social values are more resistant to change. Let's take a look in summation at society and politics. In summary, ethnicity binds groups together, it engenders solidarity, and it separates groups from others. National identity provides political aspirations for a group. Citizenship is different. It defines an individual's relationship with the state. Most modern identities have developed alongside our modern state, and ethnic or national differences may lead to conflict under certain conditions. Individuals are positioned within groups by their political attitudes, their ideologies, and their culture. With regard to attitudes, radicals, liberals, conservatives, and reactionaries differ in their views toward established institutions. Moving from attitudes to ideology, liberals, communists, social democrats, fascists, anarchists, fundamentalists prioritize very different policy goals. Cultural values shape society's ideology and attitudes and are resistant but not immune to change over time. So in comparative politics, we look at all of these ideologies, these attitudes, and the cultural values of society in order to assess the possibility for change over time.